When the Strait of Hormuz was closed at the beginning of the Iran war, the world expected oil prices to explode.
The war with Iran is having an impact far beyond the Middle East.
The price of crude oil shot to its highest level since 2023 this week.
The price of crude oil has risen above $100 a barrel.
More than 13 million barrels of Middle Eastern exports were suddenly at risk. Normally, a shock of this magnitude could send crude prices soaring. But something unexpected happened. Oil prices did not spiral out of control. And one country played a surprisingly important role in preventing it: China. At first, China did exactly what you would expect from the world's largest oil importer. It bought more crude. But about a month into the war, Beijing suddenly changed direction. Between April and June, China's crude oil imports fell by around 40%. This was not simply a reaction to falling demand, it was a deliberate strategy. China was effectively turning down the amount of oil its economy needed, and that decision helped absorb one of the biggest energy shocks in recent history. The key to understanding what happened is a concept called demand destruction. Instead of trying to replace every lost barrel of oil, China reduced the number of barrels it needed in the first place. There were several ways Beijing did this. The first was electrification. China now sells enormous numbers of electric vehicles. More than half of passenger vehicles sold in the country are electric. Electric trucks are also becoming increasingly common. Every vehicle that runs on electricity instead of gasoline or diesel represents another potential barrel of oil that China no longer needs. The second tool was government policy. China restricted exports of refined petroleum products such as gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. That reduced the incentive for refineries to operate at full capacity. And if refineries process less crude, they obviously need less crude oil. But China went even further. Domestic consumption of refined fuels also fell, so Beijing wasn't simply finding another source of oil, it was changing the equation on the demand side. But there was another piece of the puzzle. China had been preparing for this moment for years. Long before the Iran war, Beijing had quietly accumulated enormous quantities of crude oil. Whenever oil prices became relatively cheap, China often bought more than it immediately needed. The excess went into storage. This explains something that puzzled oil analysts in previous years. Global production sometimes appeared to exceed global consumption. So where did all that extra oil go? A large part of the answer was China. The country was effectively turning cheap oil into a strategic reserve. And by the time the Iran war began, those reserves had become enormous. China's stockpiles were reportedly larger than the combined reserves of several major economies. This gave Beijing something most oil-importing countries do not have: time. When supply was suddenly disrupted, China did not have to immediately compete for every barrel available on the global market. It could simply open its reserves, and that's exactly what happened. Think about what this means. The world's largest oil importer had built a system capable of reducing its dependence on the global oil market precisely when that market was under extreme pressure. China had massive oil reserves, it had coal, it had rapidly expanding solar and wind power, and most importantly, it had millions of electric vehicles replacing gasoline-powered transportation. This combination created something that could almost be described as an oil fortress. China was still heavily dependent on imported crude, but it had created multiple layers of protection. If imports were disrupted, reserves could be released. If gasoline demand increased, electric vehicles could absorb part of the transportation demand. If gas or oil supplies became more expensive, domestic coal and renewable electricity could provide alternatives in parts of the energy system. The goal was not complete independence overnight. The goal was resilience. But China's oil strategy is not only about wars, it is also about sanctions. Before the Iran war, China was buying a significant share of its oil from countries under US sanctions, including Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. That creates a vulnerability. If Washington can restrict access to financial systems, shipping, or international trade, China's energy supply could potentially be affected. So Beijing has another reason to build enormous reserves: insulation. The more oil China has stored, the more time it has to absorb a disruption. This changes the balance of power. For decades, oil producers, such as Saudi Arabia, had enormous influence because they controlled supply. China now is approaching the problem from the opposite direction. It controls an enormous share of demand. and now it also controls an enormous amount of stored supply. That combination gives Beijing unusual leverage. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Iran war is not how much oil China stored, it is how much oil China may no longer need. Stockpiling demand can return. Once Middle Eastern supplies recover, China could begin buying crude again to rebuild its reserves. But the oil displaced by electrification is different. When millions of cars switch from gasoline to electricity, that demand does not simply return when oil prices fall. This creates a structural change in the global oil market. China may still import enormous quantities of crude, but the amount it needs for transportation could continue falling. And if the world's largest oil importer permanently reduces its consumption, the consequences extend far beyond China. OPEC could face a smaller market. Oil producers could compete more aggressively for Chinese buyers. Russia could become more dependent on China's demand, and global oil prices could eventually develop a lower long-term floor. So, did China save the world from an oil price explosion? Perhaps not by itself. The global oil market is far more complicated than a single country. But the Iran war revealed something that many analysts had underestimated. China is no longer simply a passive consumer of global energy. It can influence the market by changing its demand. It can influence the market through its enormous reserves. It can reduce oil consumption through electrification, and it can use domestic energy resources and renewable power to reduce its exposure to external shocks. This is why China's energy strategy matters far beyond oil. Beijing is trying to build an economy that is harder to disrupt, an economy that can survive sanctions, an economy that can withstand supply shocks, and eventually an economy that needs the global oil market less than it once did. The Iran war may therefore be remembered for more than the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It may also mark the moment the world realized that the biggest force shaping the future of oil may no longer be the countries producing it. It may be the country consuming it.